In 1965, amidst the shifting tides of New York City, the Prescott family stood as a symbol of old wealth and tradition. Victoria Prescott, a woman in her early 50s with immaculate silver hair and sharp blue eyes, sat in her luxurious living room, sipping Earl Grey tea. The room, adorned with antique furniture and priceless art, epitomized the status and power she cherished. "Charles, darling," she called out, her voice resonating through the mansion. "Don't forget your board meeting this afternoon. Wear the navy suit I had tailored for you last month." Charles Prescott, Victoria's only son and heir to the family fortune, emerged from his room. At 32, he was tall and handsome, with chiseled features and green eyes that mirrored his late father's. His dark hair was neatly combed, but his expression carried a hint of fatigue. "Yes, mother," he replied, adjusting his tie. "I remember the meeting, and I'll wear the navy suit." Victoria nodded approvingly, but frowned at a crease in his shirt. "Make sure you look impeccable, dear. The future of Green Tech Incorporated depends on it." Charles suppressed a sigh. Green Tech Incorporated, the family's renewable energy company, had been his father's pride. Since his father's death 5 years ago, the weight of its legacy had fallen on Charles, a burden he wasn't always sure he wanted to carry. As he prepared to leave, his thoughts turned to his father, Richard Prescott. A larger-than-life figure, Richard had been a ruthless businessman, but a devoted father. Officially, he had died in a car accident. But Charles couldn't shake the feeling there was more to the story, especially when he noticed his mother's lingering gaze on his father's portrait. "Oh, and Charles," Victoria added as he reached the door, "don't forget the charity gala next week. I've invited Elizabeth Vanderbilt. She's lovely and from an excellent family. I think you two would get along splendidly." Charles nodded noncommittally, knowing his mother's idea of getting along meant a society wedding within the year. It was a familiar dance, Victoria introducing him to eligible women, and Charles politely deflecting. Stepping into the crisp autumn air, Charles took a deep breath. Jenkins, the family chauffeur, was waiting by the car. "Good morning, sir. Where to today?" "To the office, Jenkins," Charles replied, settling into the back seat. "But first, let's stop by St. Mary's Orphanage. I want to drop off those supplies." As the car pulled away, Charles gazed at the changing leaves of Central Park, feeling a disconnect between his world and the reality beyond its gilded gates. He had no idea his carefully ordered life was about to be upended. At St. Mary's, Charles felt a sense of peace. This monthly visit was more than charity. It was a reminder of life beyond boardrooms and cocktail parties. "Good morning, Sister Margaret," he greeted the nun at the entrance. "Charles, my dear boy," she replied warmly. "The children have been asking about you." For the next hour, Charles read stories to the orphans, sorted donations, and listened to their dreams. Among these children, who had so little yet gave so much, he felt most like himself. As he prepared to leave, Sister Margaret handed him a small, crudely wrapped package. "For your mother, a thank you from the children." Charles nodded, touched by the gesture, though he knew Victoria would likely never open it. He thanked Sister Margaret and promised to deliver it personally. Back in the car, Charles checked his watch. The board meeting wasn't for another 2 hours, and the thought of returning to the office felt suffocating. "Jenkins," he called, "let's take a detour. I feel like trying somewhere new for lunch." Jenkins raised an eyebrow but nodded, steering the car to a quieter part of the city. Charles spotted a small restaurant tucked between a bookstore and a florist. "Here, Jenkins," he said, stepping out. "I won't be long. Take a break." The restaurant was unlike anywhere Charles had dined before. It was cozy, with mismatched chairs and checkered tablecloths. The walls were adorned with local artwork, and the air smelled of home-cooked meals. As Charles stood in the doorway, a voice startled him. "Table for one?" He turned to see a captivating woman with long dark hair and warm brown eyes. "Yes," he stammered, uncharacteristically flustered. The woman, Sophia, according to her name tag, led him to a table by the window. "First time here?" she asked, a hint of a smile on her lips. Charles nodded. "Is it that obvious?" Sophia laughed. "The suit is a bit of a giveaway. Not our usual lunch crowd." As she turned to leave, Charles called out, "What would you recommend?" "Our signature drink, Midnight Sky. It's an acquired taste, but I think you might like it." "I'll take it," Charles said, surprising himself with his eagerness. As Sophia walked away, Charles couldn't help but watch her. She moved with grace and confidence, her warmth and intelligence drawing him in. When she returned with the drink, they began to talk. He learned she was saving for college, volunteered at a community center, and had a passion for art. For the first time in years, Charles felt the weight of his responsibilities fade. He was truly present, truly alive. When he finally glanced at his watch and realized he was almost late for the meeting, he felt a pang of regret. He paid his bill, leaving a generous tip, and turned to leave. At the door, he paused and looked back at Sophia. "I'll be back," he said, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice. Sophia smiled, a glimmer of hope in her eyes. "I'll believe it when I see it, Mr. Suit," she said. As Charles stepped back onto the street, he felt something shift deep within him. He didn't realize it yet, but his encounter with Sophia was about to set off a series of events that would challenge everything he thought he knew about himself, his family, and the world he lived in. Over the next few weeks, Charles found himself returning to the small restaurant again and again. Each visit deepened his connection with Sophia, and he began opening up to her in ways he never had with anyone else. They talked about their dreams, fears, and hopes for the future. Charles was captivated by Sophia's passion for social justice and her dedication to making a difference in her community. One afternoon, during Sophia's break, Charles finally gathered the courage to ask her on a proper date. Sophia hesitated, her eyes searching his face. "Charles," she said softly, "I like you, I really do, but we come from different worlds. Are you sure this is what you want?" Charles reached across the table, taking her hand in his. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." Their first date was a far cry from the lavish affairs Charles was used to. They attended a small art gallery opening where Sophia knew the artist, followed by a walk in the park and ice cream from a street vendor. For Charles, it was a revelation, a glimpse into a world where joy didn't come with a price tag. As weeks turned into months, Charles found himself falling deeply in love. Sophia challenged him, inspired him, and made him want to be a better person. For the first time in his life, he began to question the path that had been laid out for him since birth. However, Charles's newfound happiness didn't go unnoticed by Victoria. She watched with growing concern as her son became more distant, often missing family dinners and social events. The final straw came when Charles declined to attend a charity gala where Victoria had once again invited Elizabeth Vanderbilt. "Charles." Victoria cornered him in his room one evening, her voice tight with frustration. "What is going on with you? You've been distracted, neglecting your responsibilities. And now I hear you've been seen gallivanting around town with some waitress." Charles felt a surge of anger at his mother's dismissive tone. "Her name is Sophia, Mother, and yes, I've been seeing her. She's intelligent, compassionate, and she makes me happy. I thought that's what you wanted from me." Victoria's eyes flashed. "Happy? Charles, darling, happiness is a luxury we can't afford. We have responsibilities, expectations to meet. The Prescott name carries weight, and with that comes certain obligations." "Maybe I'm tired of living up to the Prescott name," Charles shot back. "Maybe I want to make my own path." Victoria recoiled as if she'd been slapped. "Your father would be ashamed to hear you speak like this. He built this company, this legacy for you, and you're willing to throw it all away for some girl you barely know." Charles felt a familiar pang at the mention of his father. "Dad would have wanted me to be happy," he said quietly. Victoria's expression softened slightly. "Oh, Charles, of course I want you to be happy, but there are other considerations. What about the company? What about our standing in society? You can't possibly think this girl would fit into our world. Maybe I don't want to fit into that world anymore, Mother, Charles replied, his voice firm. Sophia has shown me there's more to life than board meetings and charity galas. She's opened my eyes to the real world, to the struggles and joys of ordinary people. And you know what? I like that world a lot better than ours. Victoria's face hardened. I see. Well, if that's how you feel, perhaps it's time we had a more serious conversation about your future at Green Tech Incorporated. Your father always said the company needed a strong, focused leader. If you're not prepared to be that leader, maybe we should start looking at other options. The threat hung in the air between them. Charles knew his mother held significant sway with the board of directors. If she wanted to, she could make his position at the company very difficult. Are you threatening me, Mother? Charles asked, his voice low and dangerous. Victoria straightened, her chin lifting. I'm simply reminding you of your responsibilities, Charles. The choice is yours. As she turned to leave, Charles called out, I'm bringing Sophia to my birthday party next month. I want you to meet her properly. Victoria paused at the door, not turning around. We'll see about that, she said coldly before sweeping out of the room. Left alone, Charles sank onto his bed, his head in his hands. He loved Sophia, of that he was certain. But was he ready to risk everything, his family, his inheritance, his entire way of life for her? And even if he was, would it be fair to ask Sophia to enter this world of wealth and privilege that was so foreign to her? As the sun set outside his window, casting long shadows across his room, Charles realized he was standing at a crossroads. The path he chose now would shape not just his future, but the future of everyone he cared about. With a heavy heart, he reached for his phone to call Sophia. They had a lot to talk about. The night of Charles's birthday party arrived, bringing with it a palpable tension that seemed to permeate the very air of the Prescott mansion. The estate was a vision of elegance, with fairy lights twinkling in the manicured gardens and the soft strains of a string quartet drifting through the open windows. Inside, Victoria flitted from guest to guest, the perfect hostess in a shimmering black gown that spoke of understated wealth. But those who knew her well could see the tightness around her eyes, the brittle edge to her smile. Her gaze constantly darted to the entrance, watching, waiting. Charles stood by the bar, nursing a glass of scotch, his stomach a knot of anxiety. He had tried to prepare Sophia for this world. But how could he truly convey the shark-infested waters of high society to someone who had never experienced it? He checked his watch for the 1,000th time, willing Sophia to arrive. As if summoned by his thoughts, there was a stir at the entrance. Charles's heart leapt as he saw Sophia step into the room. She was a vision in a simple black dress, her hair swept up elegantly. For a moment, everything else faded away as their eyes met across the crowded room. But then Charles noticed something odd. The dress Sophia wore looked strangely familiar. With a sinking feeling, he realized it was identical to the uniforms worn by the serving staff. His eyes darted to his mother, who was watching the scene unfold with a look of cold satisfaction. Before Charles could reach Sophia, Victoria glided over, arms outstretched in a mockery of welcome. "Sophia, darling," she cooed, loud enough for nearby guests to hear. "I'm so glad you could make it. That uniform suits you perfectly. Now be a dear and fetch me a glass of champagne, won't you?" Sophia's face flushed with confusion and embarrassment as the implications of Victoria's words sank in. She looked at Charles, who was pushing his way through the crowd, his face a mask of fury. "Mother," Charles hissed as he reached them, placing a protective arm around Sophia. "What have you done?" Victoria's smile never wavered. "I've simply helped your friend feel more comfortable in our world, darling. After all, we wouldn't want her to feel out of place, would we?" The murmurs and titters of the gathered guests washed over them. Sophia stood rigid, her face burning with humiliation. Charles could feel her trembling beneath his arm. "This is unacceptable," Charles said, his voice low and dangerous. "Sophia is my guest, not staff. How dare you treat her this way? Victoria's eyes hardened. I'm simply looking out for your best interests, Charles. Surely you can see that this dalliance has gone on long enough. It's time to remember who you are and where you come from. As the confrontation unfolded, the party guests watched with a mixture of shock and morbid fascination. Among them was James Harrison, a Vietnam War veteran, and Charles's childhood friend who had recently started working at Green Tech Incorporated. He watched the scene with a frown, his hand unconsciously rubbing the prosthetic leg hidden beneath his trousers. Sophia, finding her voice at last, stepped forward. "Mrs. Prescott," she began, her voice steady despite the tension, "I may not come from your world, but that doesn't mean I don't deserve respect. Charles sees something in me that you clearly don't, and I won't let you diminish that." Victoria's smile faltered for the first time, but before she could respond, Charles stepped in. "This ends now, Mother. Sophia is part of my life, and if you can't accept that, then maybe I don't belong in this world either." The room fell silent, the weight of Charles's words hanging in the air. Victoria's expression shifted from anger to something resembling regret, but she said nothing. Charles took Sophia's hand and led her out of the room, leaving the stunned guest and his mother behind. As they stepped into the cool night air, Sophia turned to Charles. "Are you sure about this?" she asked, her voice trembling. Charles looked into her eyes and nodded. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." Sophia stood tall, her voice steady despite the obvious distress. "Mrs. Prescott," she began, "I came here tonight out of respect for Charles and a genuine desire to understand his world. I never expected to be treated with such cruelty and disrespect." Victoria's mask slipped for a moment, revealing a flicker of surprise at Sophia's composure. But before she could respond, a commotion near the bar drew everyone's attention. A drunk guest had bumped into a waiter, sending a tray of champagne glasses crashing to the floor. As the waiter scrambled to clean up the mess, the guest sneered. "Well, looks like we got another clumsy one here. Maybe she can give you some pointers," he said, gesturing crudely at Sophia. The room fell silent, tension thick in the air. Charles started forward, fists clenched, but Sophia placed a restraining hand on his arm. With quiet dignity, she walked over to the waiter and knelt down to help clean up the broken glass. "Let me help you with that," she said softly, ignoring the stares and whispers around her. As she worked, Sophia felt someone kneel beside her. Looking up, she saw James, his prosthetic leg visible as he shifted position. "You shouldn't have to do this," he said quietly, his eyes filled with understanding and a hint of admiration. Sophia managed a small smile. "Maybe not, but it's the right thing to do." Their quiet exchange was interrupted by slow, sarcastic applause. Victoria stood at the center of the room, her face a mask of cold amusement. "Well, isn't this touching?" she said, her voice dripping with disdain. "It seems Charles's little waitress has found her calling after all. Perhaps we should offer her a permanent position." Charles had had enough. He strode across the room, his face thunderous. "That's enough, Mother. This party is over." Victoria's eyes widened in shock. "Charles, you can't be serious. What about your guests? What about?" "I said it's over," Charles repeated, his voice ringing with finality. He turned to address the room. "I apologize for the disruption, but I'm afraid I must ask you all to leave. Thank you for coming." As the guests began to file out, murmuring in confusion and excitement at the scandal they had witnessed, Charles turned to Sophia. "I'm so sorry," he said, his voice breaking. I never imagined she would go this far." Sophia looked up at him, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. "I think I need to go home now, Charles." James stepped forward. "I can give her a ride, Charles." "You stay here and deal with this," he said, gesturing vaguely at the chaos around them. Charles nodded gratefully. As Sophia turned to leave, he caught her hand. "Sophia, please, can we talk tomorrow? I promise I'll make this right." Sophia hesitated, then nodded slightly before allowing James to lead her out. As the door closed behind them, Charles turned to face his mother. The room was empty now, save for the two of them and the cleaning staff, who were already clearing away the debris of the ruined party. "How could you?" Charles asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "How could you be so cruel?" Victoria's composure finally cracked. "I did what I had to do to protect you, to protect our family name. You'll thank me for this one day, Charles. You'll see that I was right." Charles shook his head, a mixture of anger and sadness washing over him. "No, Mother, I won't. Because you're wrong. About Sophia, about me, about everything. And now I'm not sure I even know who you are anymore." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving Victoria standing alone in the wreckage of the party, the echoes of her actions reverberating through the empty room. The days following the disastrous birthday party were a blur for Charles. He tried repeatedly to contact Sophia, leaving voicemails, sending texts, and even showing up at the restaurant where she worked. But each attempt was met with silence. It was as if Sophia had vanished into thin air, leaving behind only the bitter taste of humiliation and heartbreak. Charles's anger at his mother simmered just below the surface, making their interactions tense and frigid. Victoria, for her part, seemed to oscillate between smug satisfaction and genuine concern for her son's well-being. But Charles couldn't bring himself to forgive her, not yet. 1 week after the party, Charles found himself sitting in his office at Green Tech Incorporated, staring blankly at a stack of reports he should have been reviewing. A knock at the door startled him out of his reverie. "Come in," he called, expecting his secretary with yet another pile of documents. Instead, James limped into the room, his prosthetic leg making a soft thud with each step. "You look like hell, buddy," he said, settling into the chair across from Charles. Charles managed a wry smile. "Thanks for the update. I hadn't noticed." James leaned forward, his face serious. "Look, Charles, I've known you since we were kids. I've never seen you like this over a girl before. What is it about Sophia?" Charles sighed, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "She's different, James. She sees the world in a way I never have before. She makes me want to be better, to do more. And now I might have lost her because of my mother's cruelty." James nodded thoughtfully. "I get it. When I came back from Nam, everything seemed different. But Sophia, she's got a strength to her. I saw it at the party. Don't give up on her just yet." "I'm trying not to," Charles replied. "But she won't answer my calls. I don't know where else to look." James was quiet for a moment, then said, "Have you tried the community center where she volunteers? Teaching English to immigrants, right?" Charles's eyes widened. In his desperation to contact Sophia directly, he had completely forgotten about her volunteer work. "James, you're a genius," he exclaimed, already reaching for his coat. The community center was located in a part of town that Charles rarely visited. The building was old and in need of repair, but there was a warmth to it that spoke of the lives touched and changed within its walls. As Charles approached the reception desk, he could hear the faint sounds of a class in session. The receptionist, an elderly woman with kind eyes, looked up at him curiously. "Can I help you, young man?" she asked. "I'm looking for Sophia," Charles said, trying to keep the desperation out of his voice. "She teaches English here. Is she in today?" The woman's expression softened. "Ah, Sophia. Such a lovely girl. I'm afraid she hasn't been in for the past week. Called in sick. Poor thing." Charles's heart sank. Another dead end. But as he turned to leave, the woman called out, "Wait a moment. Are you Charles?" He spun back around. "Yes, that's me. Has Sophia mentioned me?" The woman nodded, reaching for something under her desk. "She left this for you, in case you came looking." She handed him a small envelope. With trembling hands, Charles opened it. Inside was a simple note in Sophia's flowing handwriting. Asterisk Charles. "I'm sorry for disappearing on you. What happened at the party? It made me realize how different our worlds are. I need some time to think. to figure out if I can be a part of your life without losing myself. Please don't try to find me. I'll reach out when I'm ready. Sophia, asterisk. Charles read the note several times, his emotions a whirlwind of relief, sadness, and hope. She hadn't completely shut the door on their relationship, but the ball was firmly in her court now. As he walked back to his car, Charles felt a new resolve forming within him. He couldn't control Sophia's decision, but he could control his own actions. It was time to take a hard look at his life, his family, and his role at Green Tech Incorporated. When Sophia came back, he wanted to be a man worthy of her love and respect. With newfound determination, Charles headed back to the office. He had work to do, not just at Green Tech, but on himself. And for the first time in days, he felt a glimmer of hope for the future. Weeks passed, and Charles threw himself into his work at Green Tech Incorporated with renewed vigor. He initiated new projects focused on sustainable energy solutions for underprivileged communities, much to the board's surprise and his mother's barely concealed disapproval. Yet, despite his busy schedule, thoughts of Sophia were never far from his mind. One crisp autumn morning, Charles was summoned to an emergency board meeting. As Charles entered the conference room, he was struck by the tense atmosphere. The board members sat in stony silence, their faces a mixture of shock and apprehension. At the head of the table sat an unfamiliar figure, an elderly man with piercing blue eyes and a stern expression. Victoria, seated to the man's right, looked pale and shaken. As Charles took his seat, the stranger cleared his throat and began to speak. "For those of you who don't know me," he announced, his voice carrying the weight of authority, "I'm George Hawthorne. I'm the majority shareholder of Green Tech Incorporated, and I've decided it's time to take a more active role in the company's future." Charles felt a jolt of surprise. He had always known there was a mysterious majority shareholder, but the man's identity had been a closely guarded secret. Why was he revealing himself now? George continued, his gaze sweeping the room. "I've been watching this company's operations from afar for years, and I must say, I'm not entirely pleased with what I've seen. It's time for some changes." Victoria leaned forward, her voice strained. "Mr. Hawthorne, may I assure you that under my guidance, Green Tech has." George cut her off with a wave of his hand. "Save it, Victoria. I'm not interested in your assurances. I'm here to announce that I'll be appointing someone new to lead Green Tech into the future." The room erupted in murmurs of shock and confusion. Charles felt as if the ground was shifting beneath his feet. He had always assumed he would take over as CEO one day. Was this mysterious shareholder about to dash his future plans? George raised his hand for silence. "I've chosen someone who I believe has a vision and integrity to lead this company in a new direction. Someone who understands the importance of social responsibility alongside profitability." The door to the conference room opened, and Charles's heart nearly stopped. There, looking equally shocked and determined, stood Sophia. George smiled, the first genuine expression he had shown since the meeting began. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to introduce you to my granddaughter, Sophia Hawthorne, the new CEO of Green Tech Incorporated." The room exploded into chaos. Board members shouted questions. Victoria looked as if she might faint, and Charles could only stare at Sophia, his mind reeling. Sophia stepped forward, her eyes locking with Charles's for a brief, intense moment before she addressed the room. "I know this comes as a shock to all of you. It's a shock to me as well. I only learned of my grandfather's plans and my true heritage a few days ago." She paused, taking a deep breath before continuing. "I may not have the business experience that some of you do, but I have a vision for what this company could be, a force for positive change in the world. I hope that you'll give me a chance to prove myself." As the meeting dissolved into heated discussions and hurried introductions, Charles remained rooted to his chair, trying to process the revelation. Sophia, the woman he loved, was not only the granddaughter of Green Tech's owner, but now its CEO. The waitress's mother had so cruelly humiliated was now her boss. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on Charles. As he watched Sophia confidently field questions from the board members, he felt a mixture of pride, love, and uncertainty. What did this mean for their relationship? For his future at the company? One thing was clear. Nothing would ever be the same again. As Sophia's eyes met his across the room once more, Charles knew that they had a lot to talk about. The game had changed, and he wasn't sure if he was a player or a pawn anymore. In the weeks following Sophia's shocking appointment as CEO, Green Tech Incorporated was thrust into a whirlwind of change. The press had a field day with the story of the waitress turned CEO, and Sophia found herself thrust into the spotlight, her every move scrutinized by the media and industry analysts alike. Charles, for his part, threw his full support behind Sophia, working tirelessly to help her navigate the complex world of corporate leadership. Their personal relationship remained in a state of limbo, both of them silently agreeing to focus on the company for now. It was during this tumultuous time that Green Tech Incorporated faced its greatest challenge yet. On a rainy Tuesday morning, Sophia was in her new office when her assistant burst in, looking pale. "Ms. Hawthorne, you need to see this," she said, handing Sophia a tablet. Sophia's heart sank as she read the headline. Green Tech Incorporated accused of massive environmental violations. The article detailed allegations that one of Green Tech's solar panel manufacturing plants had been dumping toxic waste into a nearby river for years, causing severe environmental damage and potential health risks to local communities. "Get Charles and the legal team in here now," Sophia ordered, her mind racing. Within the hour, the conference room was filled with tense executives and lawyers. Charles sat beside Sophia, his face grim as they discussed the allegations. "How could this happen?" Sophia demanded, her voice tight with anger and disappointment. "We're supposed to be a leader in clean energy. This goes against everything we stand for." The head of operations, a man named Frank who had been with the company for decades, cleared his throat nervously. "Ms. Hawthorne, you have to understand, sometimes in manufacturing, there are compromises made to maintain profitability." Sophia's eyes flashed dangerously. "Compromises? You call poisoning a community a compromise?" Charles interjected, his voice calm but firm. "What Frank means is that under the previous leadership, there may have been decisions made that prioritize profit over environmental concerns. But that doesn't excuse what's happened." Sophia nodded, taking a deep breath to center herself. "All right, here's what we're going to do. First, we shut down the plant immediately. Second, we launch a full internal investigation. I want to know how this happened, who knew about it, and for how long. Third, we reach out to the affected communities and environmental agencies. We need to take full responsibility and start making this right." The room erupted in protests. Shutting down the plant would be costly, potentially leading to layoffs and a hit to their stock price. The legal team advised against admitting fault so quickly. But Sophia stood firm. "I understand the financial implications," she said, her voice rising above the din. "But if we don't act decisively now, we risk losing everything. Our reputation, our customers' trust, and our own integrity. We're supposed to be part of the solution, not the problem." As the meeting adjourned, Charles pulled Sophia aside. "You're doing the right thing," he said softly. "It won't be easy, but I'm with you all the way." Sophia gave him a grateful smile, the first real one he'd seen since her appointment. "Thank you, Charles. I'm going to need all the support I can get." Over the next few weeks, Green Tech Incorporated was plunged into crisis mode. The plant shutdown and subsequent investigation revealed a pattern of negligence and corner cutting that went back years. Sophia made the difficult decision to fire several longtime executives who had either known about the violations or turned a blind eye. The company's stock took a hit, and there were calls from some board members for Sophia to step down. But she stood her ground, facing the media head-on and pledging full transparency and accountability. One evening, as Sophia and Charles worked late in her office, poring over reports and strategy documents, Sophia suddenly leaned back in her chair, rubbing her tired eyes. "Charles," she said quietly, "do you ever wonder if we're doing the right thing? If we can really make a difference?" Charles looked at her thoughtfully. "I used to ask myself that all the time. But watching you these past few weeks, Sophia, you're changing this company for the better. It's not easy, and it's not always pretty, but it's necessary." Sophia nodded, a small smile playing on her lips. "You know, when I was teaching English at the community center, I used to tell my students that real change starts with individual actions. I guess now we're putting that theory to the test on a much larger scale." As they turned back to their work, both felt a renewed sense of purpose. The road ahead would be difficult, but they were committed to steering Green Tech Inc. toward a more ethical and sustainable future. Outside the office window, the city lights twinkled in the darkness, a reminder of the countless lives their decisions would impact. For Sophia and Charles, it was no longer just about running a successful company. It was about living up to their ideals and making a real difference in the world. As Sophia grappled with the environmental crisis at Green Tech Inc., she found herself increasingly drawn to the broader social movements, gaining momentum across the country. The civil rights struggles, anti-war protests, and growing environmental awareness of the 1960s resonated deeply with her sense of justice and desire for change. One crisp Saturday morning, Sophia made her way to a local community center where a coalition of civil rights groups was holding a meeting. The room was packed with people from all walks of life, united in their passion for equality and justice. As Sophia listened to the speakers, she felt a familiar fire igniting within her. After the meeting, she introduced herself to the organizers, careful not to mention her role at Green Tech Incorporated. "I want to help," she said simply. "What can I do?" Over the next few weeks, Sophia threw herself into volunteer work. She helped organize voter registration drives, participated in peaceful protests, and used her teaching skills to conduct workshops on civic engagement. The work was exhausting but deeply fulfilling, reminding her of why she had wanted to make a difference in the first place. At Green Tech Incorporated, Sophia began to implement changes that reflected her growing social consciousness. She established a diversity and inclusion task force, implemented fair hiring practices, and launched initiatives to make clean energy solutions more accessible to low-income communities. These changes didn't go unnoticed. Victoria, who had been relegated to a less influential role on the board, watched with growing dismay as Sophia steered the company in a new direction. "You're going to run this company into the ground with your bleeding heart policies," Victoria snapped during one particularly heated board meeting. Sophia stood her ground. "We have a responsibility to do more than just make profits, Mrs. Prescott. We have the power to effect real change, and that's exactly what I intend to do." As tensions rose within the company, Charles found himself caught in the middle. He supported Sophia's vision, but worried about the backlash from more conservative board members and investors. One evening, as they worked late in Sophia's office, Charles broached the subject. "Sophia, I admire what you're doing, but are you sure it's wise to be so public with your activism? It could harm the company's image with certain stakeholders." Sophia looked at him, her eyes blazing with conviction. "Charles, when I took this job, I promised myself I wouldn't lose sight of who I am and what I believe in. If that means ruffling a few feathers, so be it." Charles nodded slowly, a mix of admiration and concern on his face. "I understand. Just be careful, okay? There are powerful people who won't like the changes you're making." Sophia's involvement in social movements reached a turning point when she was asked to speak at a major anti-war rally. She knew that participating could have serious repercussions for her role at Green Tech Incorporated, but she couldn't bring herself to stay silent. On the day of the rally, Sophia stood before a sea of faces, her heart pounding. "I stand before you not as a CEO, but as a citizen who believes in peace, justice, and equality," she began. Her impassioned speech about corporate responsibility and the need for businesses to take a stand on social issues electrified the crowd. As she stepped down from the podium, Sophia felt a tap on her shoulder. She turned to find James, Charles's friend and a Vietnam veteran, looking at her with a complex mix of emotions. "That was quite a speech," he said, his voice gruff but not unkind. "You've got guts. I'll give you that." Sophia swallowed hard, suddenly aware of how her words might have affected someone who had actually fought in the war. "James, He held up a hand to stop her. "You don't need to explain. I may not agree with everything you said, but I respect your right to say it. And between you and me, I think Charles could use someone like you to shake things up a bit." As they walked together through the dispersing crowd, Sophia felt a renewed sense of purpose. She knew the path ahead would be difficult, balancing her role as CEO with her commitment to social justice, but looking at the diverse faces around her, united in their hope for a better world, she knew it was a challenge she had to accept. That evening, as news of her speech spread, Sophia's phone lit up with messages. Some were supportive, others critical, but the one that caught her eye was from Charles. Asterisk, "I'm proud of you. Let's change the world together." Asterisk, with a smile, Sophia squared her shoulders and prepared to face whatever challenges lay ahead. She was ready to fight for what she believed in, both in the boardroom and on the streets. As the dust settled from Sophia's controversial speech at the anti-war rally, she found herself summoned to her grandfather's estate. George Hawthorne's mansion was a far cry from the humble apartment where Sophia had grown up, and she still felt out of place in its opulent surroundings. George was waiting for her in his study, a room lined with leather-bound books and dominated by a massive oak desk. As Sophia entered, she noticed a framed photograph on the desk, partially obscured by papers. It showed two young men, arms around each other's shoulders, grinning at the camera. "Sit down, Sophia," George said, his voice gruff but not unkind. "We need to talk about your extracurricular activities." Sophia steeled herself for a lecture, but George surprised her. "I'm not going to tell you to stop," he said. "God knows. When I was your age, I was just as idealistic. But there's something you need to understand about the history of Green Tech Incorporated and the Prescott family." He picked up the photograph Sophia had noticed earlier and handed it to her. "That's me," he said, pointing to one of the young men. "And that's Richard Prescott, Charles's father." Sophia's eyes widened in surprise. "You knew Charles's father?" George nodded, a faraway look in his eyes. "Knew him? Rich was my best friend. We started Green Tech Incorporated together back when renewable energy was just a pipe dream." As George began to tell the story, Sophia felt as if she was being pulled into the past. He spoke of two young idealists fresh out of college, determined to change the world. Richard Prescott had the charisma and business acumen, while George had the technical know-how. Together, they built Green Tech Incorporated from the ground up. "We had such big dreams," George said, his voice tinged with nostalgia. "We were going to revolutionize the energy industry, make clean power accessible to everyone. But somewhere along the way, things changed." George went on to describe how, as the company grew, Richard became more focused on profits and expansion. They began to argue about the direction of the company. Richard wanted to cut corners to increase margins, while George insisted on maintaining their commitment to sustainability and ethical practices. The final straw came when I discovered Richard had been making deals with some unsavory characters. People who didn't care about the environment or the communities we were supposed to be helping, George said, his voice heavy with old pain. "I confronted him, and it got ugly. In the end, I walked away from the company I'd helped build." Sophia listened stunned. "But if you walked away, how did you end up as the majority shareholder?" George's expression darkened. "That's where Victoria comes in. After I left, she saw an opportunity. She manipulated Richard, turned him against old friends and colleagues. By the time Richard realized what was happening, it was too late. He'd lost control of the company to his own wife." He paused, taking a deep breath before continuing. "When Richard died, well, let's just say I had my doubts about it being an accident. I used every resource I had to quietly buy up shares of the company. I couldn't let Victoria destroy everything we'd worked for. Sophia sat in shocked silence, trying to process this new information. "Does Charles know any of this?" she finally asked. George shook his head. "No, and that's part of why I'm telling you. Charles is a good man, Sophia. He's got his father's best qualities, but he deserves to know the truth about his family's history." As Sophia left her grandfather's study, her mind was reeling. The revelation cast everything in a new light: her role at Green Tech Incorporated, her relationship with Charles, even the environmental crisis they were facing. She realized that the past wasn't just history. It was alive and influencing the present in ways she was only beginning to understand. With a heavy heart, Sophia knew she had a difficult conversation ahead with Charles. The truth hit Sophia like a tidal wave, leaving her breathless and disoriented. She sat in stunned silence, her mind racing to process the enormity of what her grandfather had just revealed. The pieces of her life, her adoption, her connection to Green Tech, her relationship with Charles, suddenly clicked into place, forming a picture far more complicated than she had ever imagined. "Does Charles know?" she asked again, her voice barely above a whisper. George shook his head, his expression heavy with regret. "No one knows except me and your adoptive parents. And Victoria. I suspect she might have figured it out. It might explain her hostility toward you." Sophia felt a surge of conflicting emotions: anger, sadness, and a deep sense of betrayal. "All this time, you kept this from me? From Charles? How could you let us?" She stopped herself, unable to finish the sentence. George leaned forward, his hands trembling. "I thought I was protecting you, Sophia. I didn't want you to be caught up in the Prescott family drama or the cutthroat world of corporate politics. But when I saw how Victoria treated you at that party, I knew I had to step in. I couldn't let history repeat itself." Sophia stood abruptly, pacing the room as she tried to steady her thoughts. "This changes everything, Grandpa. Charles and we've been building something. And now I find out we're—" She couldn't bring herself to say the word. George's voice softened. "You're not siblings, Sophia. Not in the way that matters. Your mother and Richard were never married, and you and Charles share no blood relation. But I understand why this feels like a betrayal. I should have told you sooner." Sophia stopped pacing and turned to face him. "You should have told me the moment you decided to bring me into Green Tech. You should have told Charles. This isn't just about me. It's about him, too. He deserves to know the truth about his father, about his family." George nodded, his shoulders sagging under the weight of his guilt. "You're right. I've made so many mistakes, Sophia. I let my pride and my fear cloud my judgment. But I'm telling you now because I can't bear to see you and Charles suffer because of my choices." Sophia took a deep breath, trying to steady her racing heart. "I need to tell Charles. He deserves to know the truth, no matter how painful it is." George hesitated, then nodded again. "I understand, but be careful, Sophia. This revelation could destroy everything you've built together, both personally and professionally." Sophia's resolve hardened. If our relationship can't survive the truth, then it wasn't built on a strong enough foundation to begin with. I won't keep this from him. That evening, Sophia found Charles at the hospital, sitting by Victoria's bedside. The older woman was asleep, her face pale and drawn against the stark white pillows. Charles looked up as Sophia entered, his eyes tired but filled with warmth when he saw her. "Hey," he said softly, standing to greet her. "How are you holding up?" Sophia forced a smile, though her heart was pounding. "I'm okay, but we need to talk, Charles. It's important." Charles frowned, sensing the gravity in her tone. "What's wrong?" Sophia glanced at Victoria, then back at Charles. "Not here. Let's go somewhere private." They found an empty waiting room down the hall, its fluorescent lights casting a harsh glow over the sterile furniture. Sophia took a deep breath, her hands trembling as she clasped them together. "Charles, "There's something I need to tell you," she began, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions raging inside her. "It's about your father and my mother." Charles's brow furrowed in confusion. "Your mother? What does she have to do with my father?" Sophia hesitated, then plunged forward. "My mother's name was Margaret Hawthorne. She was George's daughter, my biological mother, and she was involved with your father before you were born." Charles's eyes widened in shock. "What are you saying?" Sophia took another deep breath, her voice softening. "Charles, your father and my mother had a relationship. I'm the result of that relationship. We're half-siblings." The words hung in the air, heavy and unyielding. Charles stared at her, his face a mask of disbelief. "That's not possible," he said finally, his voice hoarse. "My father would never." "He did," Sophia interrupted gently. "And I only found out today. My grandfather, George, kept it from me, from both of us. He thought he was protecting us, but he was wrong." Charles sank into a chair, his hands gripping the armrest as if to steady himself. "This can't be real," he muttered, more to himself than to Sophia. "All this time, and you're We're not siblings, Charles," Sophia said quickly, kneeling in front of him and taking his hands in hers. "Not in the way that matters. Your father and my mother were never married, and we share no blood relation. But I couldn't keep this from you. You deserve to know the truth." Charles looked at her, his eyes searching hers for answers. "Why now? Why tell me this now, when everything is already so complicated?" "Because I love you," Sophia said simply, her voice breaking. "And I can't build a future with you on lies. I need you to know who I am, where I come from, and what this means for us." Charles was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on their joined hands. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what to say, Sophia. This changes everything." "It doesn't have to," Sophia said, her voice firm despite the tears in her eyes. "We're still the same people we were before we knew this. We've built something real, Charles. Something strong. And if we face this together, we can get through it." Charles looked at her, his expression a mixture of pain and hope. "I need time to process this, Sophia. It's a lot to take in." "I understand," she said, standing and releasing his hands. "Take all the time you need, but know that I'm here for you, no matter what." As she left the waiting room, Sophia felt a strange sense of relief. The truth was out, and while it had shaken the foundation of their relationship, it had also cleared the air. Now! It was up to Charles to decide what came next. For the first time in weeks, Sophia felt a glimmer of hope. The road ahead would be difficult, but she was ready to face it, with or without Charles by her side. Patel, who approached them with a somber expression. "Mr. Prescott, Miss Hawthorne," she said gently. "I think it's time. Victoria is awake and asking for you both." Sophia and Charles exchanged a glance, their hands still clasped. Together, they rose and followed the doctor down the hallway to Victoria's room. The once formidable woman now lay frail and pale, her breathing shallow, but her eyes, though clouded with pain, still held a glimmer of their former sharpness. "Charles," Victoria whispered, her voice weak but clear. "Sophia, come closer." They approached her bedside, and Charles took his mother's hand. "We're here, Mother," he said softly. Victoria's gaze shifted to Sophia, and for a moment there was a flicker of the old hostility, but it quickly faded, replaced by something softer, regret, perhaps, or even acceptance. "Sophia," she said, her voice trembling, "I owe you an apology. I was wrong about you. I let my fear and pride blind me. You've been good for Charles, for the company, for all of us." Sophia felt a lump form in her throat. "Thank you, Mrs. Prescott," she said, her voice steady despite the emotions swirling inside her. "I only ever wanted to do what was right." Victoria nodded weakly, then turned her attention back to Charles. My son, she said, her voice barely audible now. I haven't always been the mother you deserved, but I want you to know I'm proud of you, and I trust you to lead the company and the family into the future. Charles's eyes filled with tears. I love you, Mother, he said, his voice breaking. Thank you for everything. Victoria's eyes fluttered closed, and for a moment, they thought she had slipped away. But then she spoke again, her voice so faint they had to lean in to hear her. There's something you both need to know about your father, Charles. About Richard. Sophia and Charles exchanged a glance, their hearts pounding. What is it, Mother? Charles asked. Victoria took a shallow breath, her words coming slowly. Your father, he wasn't perfect. He made mistakes. But he loved you, Charles. And he loved your mother, Sophia. He wanted to do right by both of you, but he was trapped by his own choices. Sophia felt a chill run down her spine. What do you mean? She asked. Victoria's eyes opened slightly, her gaze distant. The accident, it wasn't an accident. Richard couldn't live with the guilt of what he'd done, of the lives he'd ruined. He took his own life. The room fell silent, the weight of Victoria's words hanging heavy in the air. Charles's face was a mask of shock and grief, while Sophia felt a surge of sorrow for the man she had never known, but whose choices had shaped her life. Victoria's breathing grew more labored, and she reached out weakly to grasp Charles's hand. Forgive him, she whispered. Forgive me, and forgive yourselves. You deserve to be happy. With those final words, Victoria's hand went limp, and her breathing slowed until it stopped altogether. Charles and Sophia sat in stunned silence, their hands still clasped as they processed the enormity of what they had just learned. In the days that followed, Sophia and Charles leaned on each other more than ever. They'd buried Victoria with the dignity she deserved. But the revelations about Richard's death and the tangled web of their family's past continued to haunt them. One evening, as they sat together in the quiet of Sophia's apartment, Charles broke the silence. Sophia, he said, his voice heavy with emotion, I don't know where we go from here. Everything feels so complicated. Sophia nodded, her own heart aching. I know, but maybe we don't have to figure it all out right now. Maybe we just take it one day at a time. Charles looked at her, his eyes searching hers. Do you think we can? After everything we've learned? Sophia reached out and took his hand. I think we have to try. We've been through so much together, Charles. And despite everything, I still believe in us, in what we can build together. Charles's eyes filled with tears, and he pulled her into a tight embrace. I believe in us too, he whispered, and I'm not ready to let go of that. As they held each other, the weight of their shared history and the challenges ahead seemed to fade, if only for a moment. They knew the road ahead would be difficult, but they also knew they were stronger together. And for the first time in a long time, they allowed themselves to hope for the future of Green Tech Incorporated, for their family, and for the love that had brought them this far. Now, as they stepped into the cozy warmth of the house, the atmosphere was filled with a tentative but genuine sense of connection. The living room was alive with activity. James, Charles's friend and Vietnam veteran, was setting up a projector for a slideshow, while George's housekeeper, Mrs. Thompson, bustled about with trays of food and drinks. The centerpiece of the gathering was a large photo album. Its pages filled with memories of the Prescott and Hawthorne families, some joyful, others bittersweet. As they settled in, Charles raised a glass. To family, he said, his voice steady but emotional. To the ones we've lost, the ones we've found, and the future we're building together. Sophia added, and to Green Tech, not just as a company, but as a force for good in the world. The room echoed with murmured agreements and the clinking of glasses. George, seated in his favorite armchair, looked around at the faces of his family, his granddaughter, his adopted grandson, and the friends who had become like family. I never thought I'd live to see this day, he said, his voice thick with emotion. But here we are, together. The evening unfolded with stories and laughter. James shared tales of his work with the Veterans Program, while Sophia and Charles recounted the challenges and triumphs of transforming green tech. Even George, usually reserved, opened up about his early days with Richard Prescott and the dreams they had shared for the company. As the night deepened, Sophia found herself standing by the fireplace, staring at a photograph of her mother, Margaret, that George had placed on the mantel. Charles joined her, his presence a comforting warmth at her side. "Are you okay?" he asked softly. Sophia nodded, her eyes still on the photo. "I think so. It's strange, isn't it? How much has changed in just a year. We've faced so much, secrets, loss, betrayal. But somehow, we're still here, and we're stronger for it." Charles placed a hand on her shoulder. "We are, and we owe a lot of that to you, Sophia. You've been the heart of this family, the one who brought us all together." Sophia turned to him, her eyes glistening. "We did it together, Charles. All of us. And I think Mom would be proud of what we've built." Charles smiled, a rare, genuine smile that reached his eyes. "I think she would too." As the fire crackled in the hearth and the laughter of their makeshift family filled the room, Sophia felt a deep sense of peace. The road ahead would still have its challenges, but for the first time, she felt truly hopeful. They had faced their past, embraced their present, and were ready to build a future, not just for themselves, but for the world they hoped to serve. And in that moment, surrounded by the people she loved, Sophia knew they were exactly where they were meant to be. Now, here they were, brought together by shared pain, forgiveness, and hope for the future. Inside, the living room had been transformed. Gone were the stuffy, formal furnishings of the past. In their place were comfortable couches and chairs arranged in a circle, creating an atmosphere of intimacy and equality. James arrived next, his prosthetic leg barely noticeable as he moved with the confidence born from a year of purpose and healing. He carried a bottle of wine and a stack of photos from the latest Green Tech Community Initiative project. "You won't believe the difference we're making," he said, his eyes bright with excitement as he spread the photos on the coffee table. "Last week, we finished installing solar panels in a neighborhood that's been struggling with blackouts for years. You should have seen the kids' faces when the lights came on." Charles joined them, looking over the photos with pride. "It's amazing what we've accomplished in just a year," he said, his hand resting on Sophia's shoulder. "And it's all thanks to you, Sophia. Your vision, your compassion. You've transformed not just the company, but all of us." Sophia felt a blush creep up her cheeks. "It wasn't just me," she protested. "We did this together. All of us." As they settled into their seats, George raised his glass. "I'd like to propose a toast," he said, his voice strong despite his frail appearance. "To family, not just the one we're born into, but the one we choose. To healing old wounds and building new bridges. And to the memory of those who couldn't be here today." A moment of silence fell over the room as they all thought of Victoria and the complicated legacy she had left behind. Then Charles added, "And to Mom. She made mistakes. Terrible ones, but in the end, she brought us all together. I think she'd be proud of what we've accomplished." Sophia reached out and squeezed Charles's hand, a gesture of support and understanding. Their relationship had evolved over the past year, moving beyond the shock of their shared parentage to a deep, sibling-like bond built on mutual respect and shared purpose. As the evening wore on, they shared stories, some painful, some funny, all part of the complex tapestry of their shared history. George regaled them with tales of the early days of green tech, of Richard Prescott's visionary ideas, and Margaret Hawthorne's brilliant innovations. James spoke of his struggles after returning from Vietnam and how his work with green tech had given him a new lease on life. "You've created more than just a company," he told Sophia and Charles. "You've created a community, a movement." As the fire crackled and the wine flowed, Sophia found herself filled with a profound sense of gratitude. She thought of the scared, angry young woman she had been a year ago, humiliated at a birthday party, and unsure of her place in the world. Now, looking around at this unlikely family, her grandfather, her half-brother, their friend who had become like family, she realized that she had found something she never knew she was missing. "You know," Sophia said, drawing everyone's attention, "a year ago, if you had told me we'd all be sitting here like this, I would have said you were crazy. But now, I can't imagine it any other way." Charles raised his glass. "To crazy ideas and unexpected journeys," he said with a smile. As they clinked glasses, the warmth in the room seemed to grow, enveloping them in a sense of belonging and hope. Outside, the sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink, a fitting end to one chapter and the beautiful beginning of another. In that moment, surrounded by love and the promise of a brighter future, Sophia knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, as a family, as a company, and as a force for positive change in the world. Life's journey is rarely a straight path. It's filled with unexpected turns, painful falls, and moments that test our very souls. But it's in these challenges that we find our true strength and discover the power of forgiveness, love, and redemption. Remember, it's never too late to right the wrongs of the past. Every day is an opportunity to rebuild, to heal, and to create a legacy of kindness and compassion. Your actions, no matter how small, can ripple out and change the world around you. Family isn't just about blood. It's about the bonds we forge through understanding, acceptance, and shared purpose. Sometimes, the family we choose becomes the bedrock of our existence, supporting us through our darkest hours and celebrating our brightest moments. In the face of adversity, remember that your past doesn't define you. It's the choices you make today that shape your tomorrow. Embrace change, even when it's uncomfortable. It's often in our most challenging moments that we find our true calling and the courage to pursue it. Above all, never underestimate the power of love and forgiveness. They have the ability to heal wounds that seem impossible to mend, to bridge gaps that appear insurmountable, and to transform lives in ways we never thought possible. Your life is your message to the world. Make it one of hope, resilience, and unwavering commitment to making a difference. Because in the end, it's not about the mistakes we've made, but how we've learned from them and used that knowledge to create a better world for ourselves and for generations to come. Remember, every ending is just a new beginning in disguise. Embrace it with an open heart and a determined spirit. Your greatest chapter may just be waiting to be written. As we wrap up this compelling story, I'd love to hear your thoughts. If this tale of redemption, family, and personal growth resonated with you, why not leave a comment with the number 1 below? It's a simple way to show your appreciation and connect with others who are touched by the narrative. Of course, storytelling is an art that thrives on diverse perspectives. If there were aspects of the story you didn't quite agree with or moments that didn't sit right with you, please feel free to share your honest opinions in the comments. Your insights could spark fascinating discussions and perhaps even inspire future stories. Lastly, if you enjoyed this journey and would like to support our team's efforts to bring more captivating stories to life, consider subscribing to our channel. Your subscription is more than just a number to us. It's motivation to keep crafting narratives that touch hearts and provoke thought. Remember, your engagement, whether through comments, constructive criticism, or subscriptions, is what keeps this storytelling community vibrant and growing. We value each and every one of you, so let's keep the conversation going. What did you think of Sophia and Charles' story?